We now turn to aging and Alzheimer's. So we're first going to talk about psychological health briefly and then spend most of the time talking about Alzheimer's. I'm going to start with just an overview and then get to symptoms, causes, and treatments. In general, people over the age of 65 are pretty psychologically healthy, uh, but about a quarter of them, up to a quarter, show some signs of psychological disorder. Dementia being the most common, it's also just in general the most common mental disorder in this age range. It is characterized by broad mental loss. Now, there are many causes of this, but symptoms are similar: worse memory, worse intellectual abilities, impaired judgment, and the like. But in general, considering that in people younger than 65, there's a decent proportion that have psychological disorders, there's actually not that many, relatively speaking. Alzheimer's is something that pops up as we get a little bit older than just 65. About 20% of people 75 to 84 have Alzheimer's. And it is a progressive disease, meaning it starts slowly. And the first signs are just heightened forgetfulness. Typically, almost always, it actually starts with short-term memories. And then over time, it will expand to long-term memories that will fade. They will eventually seem totally confused, won't be able to speak well, won't be able to recognize anyone. And while it's 20% from 75 to 84, nearly half of people over 85 are in some way affected by this disease. And unless there is a cure found, by 2015, it's estimated that there will be 14 million people who will have that, which is more than 3 times the current number. And this is in large part because people are living longer and longer and longer. In the last stages, people will be bedridden and lose control of their muscles. And one of the biggest psychological problems that people have is in the initial stages, people can be aware that it's setting in, and that can be terrifying both for you and for the person and their loved ones, and can actually be a cause for anxiety and depression. It happens when something called beta amyloid precursor protein, which you can see the spelling on the slide, it causes the cells to trigger the inflammation of nerve cells. So basically, cells become inflamed. When this occurs, the brain shrinks over time, and the hippocampus and the frontal and temporal lobes especially begin to deteriorate. This obviously causes big problems, including lacking the appropriate neurotransmitters of the parts of the brain that are affected. We don't know why it happens in the first place. We know that genetics are involved, but why this beta amyloid precursor protein is causing this, how it starts, we're not 100% sure of. We also do know that there are differences in the brain functioning of people who will eventually get it, and we're going to talk about that in a second. Other people have speculated that diet could be the cause. We'll talk about that in a little while also. Other people say viruses or immune system problems, but there's nothing agreed upon. And also, something we'll talk about on the last slide is taking care of people with Alzheimer's can be difficult, in particular because it's one of those diseases that there's no cure. People can say more than basically any other situation, they are less optimistic. People are less optimistic about Alzheimer's than cancer, cardiovascular disease, for example. So it can be very hard taking care of people. So there's some studies that show that when you are trying to recall information, as you see on the slide, that there can be differences. The top is people who are at risk, The middle are typical people, and the bottom is basically taking this activity, and subtracting this activity, and you get this. So you can see that there's this type of difference in brain activity even for people prior to getting it. What goes on in the brain naturally when protein shards break, the amyloid precursor protein shards break. Usually they're cleared out of the brain, but in Alzheimer's they're not. And these shards form plaques, and that's what is causing this inflammation. So again, symptoms just spelled out a little bit more straightforward. Gradual development. At first, it's recent memories, then older memories, and later people are just unintelligible, can't even recognize their closest family and friends. And later, they have all muscle control, voluntary action can be gone. Very, very difficult. Okay, so let's jump into the causes a little bit more in greater detail than your book has, certainly. So what happens here, as we've said, is this beta amyloid precursor protein has issues. Basically, there are lesions that are associated with Alzheimer's disease, so brain injury, if you will. And they are actually 42 amino acid beta amyloid protein and microtubule associated protein tau. So we can basically just say beta amyloid and tau are the two issues we have. Tau is the protein that occurs. We've actually now found that there can be decreases in beta amyloid levels prior, excuse me, and increases in tau in the cerebrospinal fluid of people who have Alzheimer's. And this is interesting because now it's not just the brain we're talking about, but also cerebrospinal fluid. People, after they found this, found that there was a lower beta amyloid levels in older people with very early Alzheimer's, and then a rise in tau following this decline. So what does this mean? It sounds very complicated. There's a lot of stuff going on. Basically, it seems that Alzheimer's arises in large part to this imbalance between beta amyloid production and beta amyloid clearance in the brain. So it comes, it's produced, it forms these tau triangles, and it's just not able to be cleared out. Now, one of the kind of scarier but more interesting things is that there's evidence of beta amyloid levels in the cerebrospinal fluid as early as 25 years before even the symptoms start, even before symptom onset. So let's say that someone would get Alzheimer's at 70. Well, 25 years before then, or at 45, 25 years out from even the symptoms starting at all, there's actually some evidence in the cerebrospinal fluid. That is both wonderful that we have this better understanding and might be able to detect it earlier, but at the same time is very scary. Now you might be able to tell earlier in life if you are going to eventually get this, which can cause this kind of fear in life-changing issues earlier on than even before. When this occurs, there's also an appearance of these deposits in the brain. It causes increased tau and cerebrospinal fluid, and brain atrophy begins even 15 years before the symptom onset. So not only is there cerebrospinal fluid evidence of it in there 25 years before, then there are increases in tau and even some brain atrophy 15 years prior. There's also cerebral metabolism issues, and can have some subtly impaired episodic memory 10 years before other symptoms. So, because of all this information, researchers believe that therapeutic interventions that are directed at mild to moderate clinical stages of Alzheimer's might be too late. So, for example, some people have tried removing the protein using therapies in people who already have it, and it hasn't worked. And so it might be that in order to solve the Alzheimer's puzzle, we might need to be working 20 or 30 years prior in order to stop the brain from having the changes over this long term. The long term. Now, one of the issues also is there's a question as to whether or not beta amyloid causes Alzheimer's or if it's the result of it. Because again, we don't know what is really causing all of this to occur. We do know it plays this huge role, but we are unsure. Now, some research is targeted at people who we're pretty sure are going to get it, and that's how we know this 25 years out thing, because a small fraction, so basically less than 1% of Alzheimer's disease occurs in middle age because of inherited gene mutations, and they are inherited in Mendelian ways, so it's fairly straightforward to see it. But also, one of the things that I've become sadly aware of is that there's also looks for mouse models, but also for people looking at people with Down syndrome. There's almost universal Alzheimer's disease, early onset Alzheimer's in people with Down syndrome, in part because we think that on the extra 21st chromosome, there is that's where some of the cause of Alzheimer's is. So you have an extra chromosome, extra 21st chromosome, it can cause it even earlier. So a key to understanding Alzheimer's might actually be in people with Down syndrome. So what are some of the environmental influences on Alzheimer's? Well, some people have pointed to diet. People have looked at, tried to do as best we can to have kind of natural experiments. So one study looked at poor black residents in a Nigerian town, and they were less likely to develop Alzheimer's than a comparable sample of African Americans in the United States. And because they're more, these two groups were fairly highly genetically related, which is why they chose them, they thought that, or found that diet is kind of the biggest difference between the two groups. The residents in Nigeria ate primarily vegetables, and that might account for some of the difference in Alzheimer's. But of course, there's many, many other differences between the United States and Nigeria, and obviously places across the world. Other people have speculated that physical exercise, cognitive activity, education, social engagement are all variables that might slow Alzheimer's. Exercise might be in part due to enhanced cardiovascular and cerebrovascular health, meaning that basically you could possibly clear out the beta amyloid accumulation over time a little bit better, at least. In terms of intellectual activity, this lessens the risk of developing Alzheimer's, and it's actually been seen in mouse models that enriched environments decrease the amyloid. However, these environmental and lifestyle changes are unlikely to be enough to stave off Alzheimer's in general, especially if these things happen closer to the diagnosis. So maybe it's exposure over many years, and this is something that in science we have a hard time grappling with, is doing long-term understanding that we need to do long-term studies. Because if you think about it, if you need to study a sample of a lot of people with Alzheimer's, you want to do a really in-depth study, well, you got to get enough people that you will get a group of people with Alzheimer's, and the group of people who you will sample will also include people who don't get Alzheimer's, and then people who die prior to onset of Alzheimer's, people who don't participate in the study long term. So you're going to need a big, gigantic study that happens, 30, 40, 50, 60 years before this occurs. One thing to note here, something that I found very interesting, and you guys have probably heard of some of, is that Alzheimer's disease is actually similar to the brain injuries that have been made famous in football now. CTE is the disease. It's called chronic traumatic encephalopathy. This CTE is a neurodegenerative disease that is caused in part by repetitive brain trauma, including both concussive and subconcussive injuries. Meaning that it's not just concussions in football or other sports, other activities that's a problem. It's actually even the more minor subconcussive hits. This CTE results in executive dysfunction, brain dysfunction, memory impairment, depression, suicidality, poor impulse control. It was made famous in part because, well, it was discovered in a football player, a Hall of Fame center for the Steelers named Mike Webster. He committed suicide, and prior to his suicide, his life just deteriorated. He was, everybody, by all accounts, said he was just this nice, affable guy, and then over time, he ended up living in a car and losing connection with family and all of this kind of stuff. And it's actually documented in a book called League of Denial, a very, very fascinating book. I couldn't put it down, basically, that talks about the discovery of CTE and the NFL's reaction to it. So and it's also the movie, I haven't seen it, but the movie called Concussion with Will Smith is the kind of a story about it, although it seems that the NFL intervened and made them look better in the movie than they really were. So Mike Webster was committed suicide, and his brain was dissected by someone who actually had never heard of him before. He just wanted to look at his brain to see what was going on, and he found Alzheimer's, at least, or what he thought was Alzheimer's. And this was very odd because Mike Webster was too young to have Alzheimer's. And so it turned out, though, that it wasn't Alzheimer's, that they found these slight differences in it. They found the tau protein that looked like it was in the brain. It was someone with severe long-term Alzheimer's. And that was kind of the thing that started it off. Now, again, the effects here are more than just people with concussions. People have been found to have CTE who have no history of diagnosed or reported concussions. And people who play positions like lineman or linebacker actually have the greatest chances of developing CTE, in part because they have the greatest exposure to repetitive hits on the head. You would think that the people who would get this brain disease are wide receivers who run over the middle and take a huge hit from a DB, but it's actually not that way. Most of the people who have had CTE have been linemen and linebackers, people with a lot of brain trauma. And so the obsession that people have about reducing concussions in the NFL is actually a bit of a red herring. And the NFL knows this, but they want to say that they are doing something towards it. They've run an amazing PR scam on people, and they have kind of put it all on concussions and lowering concussions. But it seems like it's actually the nature of football, the nature of bashing your head into someone over and over and over. And we know this because it's not just in football. They've actually seen it in soccer players as well, to the point that in some leagues, at least some youth leagues, they've outlawed heading the ball. It seems like the players who head the ball the most often are the ones who are the most likely to get this in soccer. But it's true in other aspects of other sports, other activities where your head takes a lot of trauma, such as boxing. It seems that this disease was first talked about, not diagnosed, but talked about in 1928, when it was referred to as being punch drunk. and people understood that boxers after years and years and years can take one too many hits, but it might not be the big hits that they're taking that's the problem, but the many subconcussive hits that they take. This also can only be diagnosed post-mortem, meaning it's only after you die that you can do this. You have to take out a slice of your brain, put it under a microscope, and that's the only way at this point in time they can diagnose it, although they are working on it now. Additionally, something to point out, the reason I have boycotted the NFL despite the fact I love football is the NFL has spent millions of dollars trying to get research that is favorable to them and favorable to saying that football is not related to concussions. They had agreed to make a multi-million-dollar grant to the National Institutes of Health that were no strings attached. But when the NIH gave the grant out to some people that the NFL didn't like, they actually pulled the money back. And so the NIH had to spend its own money on there. And by its own money, we mean taxpayer dollars. So they spent millions of dollars on a study that the NFL said they would fund. And because of that, the NIH is unable to spend money doing other studies, such as ones on Alzheimer's not associated with well, it's not even Alzheimer's, not CTE. They couldn't do studies on Alzheimer's or cancer or other things like that because the NFL decided that they didn't like who got the grant. And this is all well reported in newspapers. I can send the information to you if you like. But it's amazing that they've done this, but also amazing is the fact that they have gotten quote unquote researchers who have been very receptive to their message, and they've also paid them a lot of money to get supposedly academic articles published that show that there's no link between football and brain injury, but it's been very well shown now that that's just simply not the case, and they are suffering a just tremendous PR battle. The good thing for them is people love football and love the NFL. It's incredibly compelling. I really wish I could bring myself to watch it, but they have really done some things that are honestly disgusting. This is one area that I'm not going to be unbiased in. But I digress. So treatment. While understanding of the causes of Alzheimer's is incomplete, there are several drug treatments for Alzheimer's that appear to be promising. However, none of them are effective long term. The most promising drugs are related to the loss of the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, and that occurs in some forms of Alzheimer's. There are a bunch of other drugs that are given, but they mainly alleviate symptoms, but it's still only effective in about half of Alzheimer's patients and only temporarily. The real treatment that occurs is as they lose the ability to feed and clothe themselves. They're cared for 24 hours a day. And because taking this type of care is typically impossible even for the most dedicated family, most Alzheimer's victims end their lives in nursing homes. It's estimated that patients with Alzheimer's make up 2/3 of those in nursing homes. So this is a slide that has information actually just from the Alzheimer's Association. It's alz.org. It's what they say what to do. But before we get to that, I skipped over something important, and that is that there are actually non-cognitive symptoms that are also prevalent in Alzheimer's. 41% of people with Alzheimer's have some hallucinations or delusions. 40% have no additional symptoms, 20% have one additional symptoms, 30% have primarily emotional symptoms, 13% psychotic syndromes. In general, it's not just the Alzheimer's we think of. There's typically other things that are associated as well, which makes sense given that we're talking about a wide, overarching brain disease. It's not just affecting one part of the brain. So what do? Make patients feel secure in home, and try to get them occupied in everyday tasks of living as long as possible. It seems the more that you're able to keep people with Alzheimer's doing something to take care of themselves, the better off they are long term. It's kind of like keeping them in the game is a good thing. Label objects. Give uh, just like you would, or I don't know if you guys actually did this, but one of the things that's suggested when learning a foreign language is going around and just putting a piece of masking tape and writing the words on it on things that are important for them to just keep reminding them of what it is and help them with that. But also giving simple and detailed lists of things to do and oral reminders. Clothing, have it be simple, not many zippers and buttons, and lay them out in the order in which they should be put on. That is something that people oftentimes will forget about. Put bathing on a schedule. People with Alzheimer's may be afraid of falling and hot water and may need help bathing. Stopping people from driving. This is an issue that many people have with their aging parents, is trying to get them not to drive. And although patients often want to continue driving, their accident rate is actually 20 times higher than the average. So keeping people with Alzheimer's off the road is actually pretty important, not just for them, but for the health of everyone else. Monitor the use of the telephone. Alzheimer's patients who answer phones have been victimized by agreeing to requests on the phone by salespeople, investment counselors, people like that. These people are going to the deepest circle of hell, obviously, but it still is a terrible thing for people with Alzheimer's and their caretakers to deal with. Giving opportunities to walk and exercise can help slow the muscle deterioration and stiffness, so that's important to do. And then the bottom one, take care of the caregiver. Allowing the caregiver to take some time off is important. It can be a full-time deal, like taking care of an infant, but it can actually be harder than taking care of an infant. Caretakers need their own lives, so getting support from communities and service organizations is important.